Today we're talking about the fun and exciting sign of Gemini, which always starts around May 21st or May 20th of each year, actually, and June 21st or June 22nd. And Gemini is the third sign of the natural zodiac and the first, what we call air sign, which is very much associated with communications, ideas, and thought. But before we talk about the elements and the qualities of Gemini, let's talk a little bit about the energy of the sign. This is a sign that we consider to be rather neutral. That does not suggest that if you're a Gemini person listening to this, that you're a totally neutral kind of person. Neutral, when we say neutral, we mean neutral in the sense that it is their sole purpose on this earth as they come in to convey whatever it is they have been granted to convey, information, ideas, thoughts, and to convey it to whatever parties they're being asked to convey it to. In the mythologies, and actually we will be talking more about this character later on, but briefly, Mercury or Hermes was the son of Zeus, and he was the one that was responsible for carrying the information to the different worlds. And for that reason, we oftentimes say that Gemini is a sign of communication and information services. In fact, you see a lot of people in the information services industry or in the telecommunications industry or in the television, radio industry, anything that has to do with conveying some type of information with signals to other people that are oftentimes Gemini or people who have many Gemini planets in the horoscope or people who might have been born at the time of day that the sign of Gemini happened to be on the horizon and it becomes their rising sign. So the information about that we're giving today doesn't necessarily apply if you're just a Gemini. It can apply if you have some of these other qualities in your horoscope. Now, we want to talk a little bit about the fact that Gemini is an air sign. There's 4 elements in astrology. There's earth and water, which are very slow and very responsible and very molding, shall we say. And then we have air and fire, which definitely need each other to feed off of each other. And air and fire are very different energy. Air and fire are quick, they're fast, they're excitable, they're nervous, they're hyper, they want to physically be active. And so whenever you see somebody who has a lot of Gemini, for example, in their chart, they don't even have to open their mouth. You can just watch their activities, and they're all over the room. About 99.9% of the time, they're talking with their hands. And if they're not talking with their hands, they're just moving all over the floor when they're giving a kind of presentation. And there's this kind of almost energy as if they've had, shall we say, too much coffee in the morning, because it's almost like their motor doesn't know how to stop. And this is one of the problems that Geminis will sometimes experience. They don't know when to stop the communication, or they don't know when to turn it off, or when to end it, or to remember, basically, because this is also what we call a rather distracted sign of the zodiac. Now, there's a lot of wonderful and beautiful and fun qualities about this sign, but one of their greatest difficulties is the fact that they can easily be distracted. And if we look at the element of air, let's just look at the element of air. Air is an element that doesn't really connect to any of the other elements. You can't really trap air in a bottle. You really can't trap air inside of material or a box. Air has a way of separating itself out or away from the other elements. It's constantly separating itself and diffusing. And in many ways, especially since Gemini is the first air sign of the zodiac, this is one of their qualities, is that they're constantly feeling somewhat separated from other people or from themselves. And in fact, if we look at the traditional symbol that's out there in the pop astrology books and the pop astrology stores, we see the symbol for Gemini being the twins. And it's very important that we look at that symbol, because in this symbolism, there's a story. And in that story is the entire crux on which Gemini bases its life. The symbol is the symbol of the 2 twins who were actually great war heroes, and they were Zeus's favorite war heroes. And their names were Castor and Pollux. And they had been devoted in their service to Zeus. And as a side note here, Zeus is very close to usually Mercury or Gemini energy. So there was a real tightness between these 3 characters. And what happened in one of the battles, Castor and Pollux were separated. One of the brothers was killed. And at that point, when the one brother was killed, he was taken to the underworld, at which point Zeus had no control. And now the one brother was in the underworld under the control of Pluto. And the two brothers, because they were separated, one was still alive and one was still dead, were in terrible mourning because they had been together their entire life. They had always connected. They had always had a very deep relationship. But much like when you watch twins, there's always this symbiosis that goes on between twins. And they really wanted to be together. And they begged to Zeus, because they had been such good heroes for him, please bring us back together. And he couldn't do it because his realm was not the realm of the underworld. But what he did do is he allowed them, even though he couldn't bring the one back to life, he allowed them to, and he made a deal with Pluto actually to do this, he allowed them to change places about every 12 hours. So while one brother would be on Earth and alive, he would be having one experience. And while the other brother would be in the underworld, not alive, he would be having another experience. And they would every 12 hours switch positions. So even though they couldn't be together, they would be able to have the experience of what it was like to be in the other brother's position. And so in some way, it was a compensation for them wanting to be together all of the time. Now, what does this have to do with the sign of Gemini? Well, if you look at the symbolism for these two brothers, one represents the intellectual and one represents the emotional. And one of the major concerns in a Gemini's life, and one of the major, I would say, challenges in a Gemini's life, is the challenge of trying to integrate the emotional with the intellectual. And quite honestly, it's a hard thing to do for Gemini. And this is part of why they always seem to be somewhat distracted or even sometimes scattered, because they're always struggling to bring those two parties together. And at some points, they're able to do that, but not usually. And one of the things that they'll go through is, for example, something will occur and their intuition or their mind says, I should do this, because it rationalizes it and it logically puts it through its paces. But then the heart or the emotion comes in and says, no, that doesn't feel right. And so they have this little battle going on as to which one to believe. And so it's very difficult. And this is why when people deal with Geminis or live with Geminis, they'll oftentimes say, I don't know which of my husband's or wife's persons are coming home this evening, because there's 3 or 4 or 5 people inside of every Gemini. There really is a personality switch that occurs. It's not schizophrenia. It's not a personality break. It's just that there's 2 or 3 personalities that are inside of the Gemini personality. And if one lives with one of these people, they have to really be okay with the fact that sometimes the more positive brother will be out, and sometimes the more discordant or negative brother will be out, and then eventually they'll just come around again. And the thing about it is that Gemini, because it is so scattered and distracted, it doesn't remember everything it says either. So, it's very different when a Gemini gets angry, because a Gemini may get angry and say all these incredible words that are very hurting and cutting, but it may be 5 minutes later that they don't remember anything they said. I mean, that's a very typical Gemini kind of response, as opposed to maybe another group, for example, Scorpio, for example. If they get angry, they remember everything they said and they hold it for the next time. And there's a kind of a kind of venom attached to it. But Gemini, there is no venom. It's a totally neutral kind of sign. And as a result of this, they're kind of fun. And as a result of this, they're very, very good in the industries where they have to not only connect with people. And it's so funny. I always think of the image of a butterfly, or more likely a bee, going from flower to flower. The bee, the bumblebee, is very much a symbol for Gemini, in that it carries information or it carries resources from one place to the other. So you see them in the industries of sales. They're very good salespeople. Generally speaking, successful salespeople who've been in the business a long time will generally have that sign prominent in the horoscope. Or people who are writers. In other words, writing is not just writing. I really believe that writing is getting information from someplace else, the imagination, from wherever source you believe it comes from, and somehow scribing it or transcribing it onto a piece of paper. And that's very definitely a Gemini quality, is they have this ability to just sort of tap into the universal consciousness and somehow with their miraculous mind and brain funnel it down through the body and the system and the mind, and either put it out in words or put it out in paper. And so you will see many of these people real prominent in the writing or the speaking or the teaching or the selling field. And it's very interesting. One of the symbols that we also look at for Gemini is the symbol of the magician. The first card of the tarot, if you look at a traditional tarot deck, always has a magician on the first card. And the traditional decks show a robed man standing in front of a table, And on the table in front of him are the 4 suits for the cards. The pentacles in the tarot, the coins, which is material prosperity, the cups, which represents emotion and love, the swords, which represent decision-making and cutting things away, and the rods or the wands, which represent creativity. And you see him standing in front of this table with these 4 elements in front of him, or these 4 suits. And above his head usually is what we call a lemniscule, or the symbol for eternity. And the caption on the card usually is, in the books that describe it, as above, so below. And the idea behind the magician, as it is with Gemini, is that they have all the tools they need in front of them. All they have to do is make them work by willing it. And it's very appropriate that you should see the symbol of magic wands and all the characters in stories. You see a lot of characters in stories like Jiminy Cricket, who's Pinocchio's sidekick. Gemini characters are always sidekicks. They're always the conscience and the sidekick. And Jiminy Cricket is an interesting character because if you look at the name Gemini, it really is the word Gemini, by Gemini or by Gemini. Another sidekick or another little character that's Gemini, that's playful, that's always giving information is Mickey Mouse. Another character, which is very much associated with the sign of Gemini, is the character Peter Pan, which seems to be very prominent in our society right now. The stories are back. The old Mary Martin program has been on many times now, and children are being reacquainted with this mythical character in film and video and books. And in the more formal psychological terms, Peter Pan, or the Peter Pan complex, is also referred to as the puer aeternus, or the eternal boy. And this is very definitely a Gemini quality, is the quality of, I won't grow up, I don't want to grow up, and I'm not going to grow up, whether you want me to or not. And this is part of their good news and their bad news, too, in that they really never get old. I mean, a Gemini personality, even when they get to be 70, 80, 90, there's still this sort of glint in their eye, this spark in their heels, this quality of the mind. It reminds me oftentimes of George Burns, who's moving into his 100th year in a few years. He probably, somewhere in his horoscope, has some Gemini fairly prominent because he has this attitude that he's really not old, that he's getting better. And there's this sort of like quality of humor about this character that never ages. But the thing that's negative about the Peter Pan type of personality, or the Gemini type of personality, the thing that's not so comfortable, that's not so easy, is that indeed they don't grow up many times. And indeed, they refuse to take on responsibility. And basically, agreements are made to be broken. And you always hear of the characters in mythology or in the stories, the thief or the shrewd one or whatever. And these are all Gemini characters, is that, if they're making a deal and it works for them, fine. If it doesn't work, well, maybe we can word it in a way or think of the words in a certain way that we can break the agreement. And so they may sometimes be tagged as being irresponsible. In every child, in fact, there's a wonderful, wonderful lecture I give called Age Cycles, and all children, every single child, regardless of what sign of the zodiac they're born under, from around the age of about 7 to 14, is under the rulership of the sign of Gemini or Mercury. Children are associated with this sign of the zodiac. And of course, eventually children do grow up. But Geminis don't often grow up. And in fact, there's an interesting thing. Jim Lewis, who's a very well-known astrologer, and Liz Green, too, who's also a well-known astrologer, talk about the eternal boy, or the puer aeternus, or for a woman, we call her the puella aeternus, who not only do they not grow up, but they also, if you look at their lives, they're sometimes tagged with certain qualities. First of all, they usually have a basic assumption that they are unique, special, and deserving of continuous praise. That's the first point. The second point is that if you really watch their lives, in fact, we had a very vivid example of this quite recently in the news of Bill Graham's quite sudden death. The eternal boy character, the Gemini character, will oftentimes rise to a certain point of what they call ascension. In other words, in some of the old literature books, they call them the flying boys, where they're really literally flying in their minds, or like Peter Pan, literally flying. And they'll get to this point where they're really high and they're really doing wonderful things and they're having a wonderful time. And just as quickly as they get to the heights of that, they will quite suddenly crash or fall into the sea. And very recently, we did see in the news Bill Graham, who had a very sudden, quite catastrophic death, in that And I don't know what Bill Graham was, but I'm sure with all the wheeling and dealing he did, he probably had some Gemini or strong Mercury in his horoscope someplace, that he was very well known and he did a lot and he connected a lot of people with a lot of people. And then his life was over. He never really got old. These people never really get old. I'm not suggesting that any Geminis that are listening to this will probably, when they're about to enter old age, will suddenly crash into the sea, but that it's a psychological thing that they go through too. And everybody goes through this at midlife. Everybody goes through a change in midlife where they suddenly have to review their life and go through it and see what has to be changed and what doesn't have to be changed. But it particularly makes its effect for Gemini people because this is something that they never really, in their conception of life, do see. They're also, another thing you see with Gemini people too, and it's very much associated too with the stories, is the story of how there's never really a mother figure around for these people. And it may literally be that if you're a Gemini, that when you were growing up, you had a mother, but you didn't. In other words, she might have been more of a friend or a buddy, or a person who was there to give you information, but not really the traditional, let me hug you, let me kiss you, let me feed you chicken soup kind of mom. And that's very appropriate in that if you look at the story and the mythologies of Hermes or Mercury, the winged messenger, and you look at the story of his birth, he's born in a cave, actually. His mother is Maya, which is the month of May is named after the goddess Maya. And what happens in the story is he's born and he comes out of his mother, and in one scene, she's holding him. And in the next scene of this, the first story you hear about him is he's literally jumped out of his cradle when she's asleep, and he's gone off to the fields to steal his brother Apollo's sheep, to play a trick on his brother Apollo. And this is a newborn baby who literally, all you see the mother in the story for is that she's his mother and she's holding him for a while, and then she's not in the picture anymore. And then his adventures begin, and basically the way that story goes is he comes back and crawls back in his cradle, and his father Zeus says, where'd your brother's sheep go? And he says, I don't know. And there was really no mother character for him. So these people, many times, raise themselves. They may have had a mother, they may have had a father, but in the end, they raise themselves by not only their own wit, but their own will. And they're always living by their wits. This is a group of people that always lives by its wits. It's a group of people that is always on the move. It doesn't let any grass grow under its feet. It doesn't wait for calls. It'll make calls. One of the things that they're very connected to, Gemini is very connected to the telephone. And if you want to just know which person is a Gemini in your life or has a lot of Gemini in their life, look at how many phones they have. Or look at how many televisions they have, or cassette players they have, or CD players they have. Or look at how many books are by the nightstand at night. Or look at them when they watch television. They're not just watching television, they're reading and watching television and doing a project at the same time, because this is a group that has 2 or 3 personalities. And in fact, they don't enjoy just doing one thing at a time. It always has to be at least 2. And this is perfect because this is the sign of the twins. They'll always, not always, but usually they'll have 2 marriages. They'll have 2 children, 2 pens, 2 houses, 2 cars. They'll own a lot of dual kinds of things, multiples. And the theory or the feeling behind that is, well, you can always use them. Why get rid of them? You can always use them. They're always there. And they have their little gadgets. That's one thing. And it's very much like magicians have their little tools. Geminis will have their little gadgets, much like Aquarians. If they're on the road, then they have to have the small calculator or the small radio. And they may have to have the laptop when they're traveling for computers and the computer in the office that handles more the word processing and one way of doing computerizing, and then another computer that handles more the graphic kinds of things. Any equipment that comes out that has to do with communications, modems, laser printers, it's all associated with the sign of Gemini. In fact, Geminis were probably the ones that invented them. These are also, as a result of that, the groups that sell these things and sell these services. If you look at their homes or you look at the way they dress, lots of times in fact, it's a very interesting thing. Every year, if you look at the marketplace, at the fashion marketplace, there's a planet in the sky called Jupiter, which is the planet of opportunity and good luck and expansion. And I always watch it because it takes 12 years to make a full cycle around the sun, thus spending about a year in each sign of the zodiac. And in the year, usually, that Jupiter is moving through the sign of Gemini, if you look in the marketplace, especially the fashion industry, this is the year where you will see lots and lots of bright colors and lots of tiny, 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 busy, busy prints. And it's very Gemini. And in fact, they may have a preference for that kind of fabric or that kind of look in their homes. This is a group of people that won't necessarily have to have the fancy things in the home as long as they have all the communications things in their home. This is a group of people that does real well at having an office at home. And this is dualities too. They'll have an office at their office, but they'll always have an office at the home. Because when they get up at night, because they have a sleep problem, then they have something to do to make them sleepy and put them back to sleep. This is a group that definitely suffers from insomnia. That's primarily because Gemini rules the mind. And the mind with these people is never really still for very long. And at night, especially if they have a lot of projects going on or they're trying to do problem solving, and one of their great strengths is that they are master problem solvers. You want to get a problem solved. You take it to a Gemini, you give them the problem, they'll give you an answer almost instantly back as how to solve it, how to resolve the situation. That's one of their greatest strengths, and they could actually do very well in the marketplace with that skill. But because they are problem solvers and because their minds are never really at ease, lots of times at night they have a hard time sleeping. This is definitely a group that has insomnia. And one of the first definite techniques they'll do is they'll get up and they'll turn the television on at night to just sort of make the mind passive enough so it can go to sleep. And actually, when you watch a Gemini, in order for one of the ways they do relax is they just turn on the television. They may not actually know what's going on the television, but they have it on so that their mind can just sort of come down and relax and eventually go to sleep. But the other thing they will do at night, too, because they're really very definitely night owls, is if they can't sleep, they have an office in the home or a writing place in the home. They'll get up and they'll do some writing or some, diary writing or journal writing. And for some reason, once they get it's almost like the thoughts in the mind do like a backup in their brain. And they have to really get the thoughts out on something before they really can let their mind settle to go to sleep. It's almost like their minds are kind of like these computers. So we do see a highly nervous individual here. Usually they're not very big, generally speaking, unless they have other planets in the horoscope that would show them to be a larger physical body. Usually they're quite diminutive and quite small, very much in line with the symbolism of the winged messenger. The parts of the body that Gemini rules are, of course, the lungs, which is the breathing apparatus, the hands, and the arms. And one of the things that's very, very important for Gemini people is that they do not smoke or they're even around smoke, because one of the things, their lungs are extremely sensitive, and their particular body type needs a lot of oxygen and a lot of oxygenation, and of course the smoking doesn't particularly help that. But, this is the group, either if you're a Gemini or you have Mercury prominently placed in the horoscope, this is the group that's probably going to be more prone to allergies and is prone more to allergies than other groups of people because there is such a strong sensitivity. The other parts of the body, as I mentioned, are the hands and the arms, which are always moving when they're talking. But the other side of that is that when they're being blocked creatively, especially if they're writers, they will many times notice that the arms and the hands somehow either have numbness or tingling or fall asleep a lot. And one of the best things you can do for a Gemini personality is to really literally pick up their hands and really rub them and rub their forearms, because this is a part of the body that's used more than anybody really realizes. Especially if they're computer workers or they're using their hands in some kind of communication kind of media. This is a group, and I'm not saying if you're a Gemini that this is what's going to happen, but you do see a lot of people who haven't brought a lot of balance into their life that have a lot of Gemini in their charts who are prone to nervous disorder of some sort, nervous breakdowns, especially if there's tremendous amounts of stress, psychic breaks, sometimes schizophrenia. Not everybody has a possibility of moving to that state, but for some reason, because the Gemini has the dual or triple personality, we see this a lot when you look at charts of people who've had nervous disorders. There seems to be a very strong either Gemini prominent in the horoscope, or at the time of the nervous disorder, it was doing something with that part of their charts. Now, this is an interesting thing because as we're moving into the new times, as we're moving towards the turn of the century, a lot of what we used to call psychic breaks before aren't really psychic breaks anymore. They're really people starting to open up to perceptions that have always been there. But until our society was more developed, we really didn't realize they were there. There's a book that was written quite recently in Canada by a group of psychologists or therapists called Spiritual Emergency. And it's actually been written for therapists, and it's apparently been a seminar that's being taught throughout Canada, and it's just starting to come to the United States. And the book basically talks about how we're finding more and more people are not necessarily having psychic breaks. And this is really a wonderful thing to be writing about now, because the United States society, this country, has a very strong eternal boy kind of consciousness, a strong Gemini consciousness. They're born at the time of day. The Gemini was on the rising sign or on the ascendant. So you see a lot of people in this country preoccupied with youth and easily distracted and doing a million things at one time. But going back to the book talks about how we need to start looking, as the society develops in its consciousness, at the difference between people that are having psychic breaks and people that are literally seeing other realities. And if you want to use the word psychic, you can use that. It doesn't necessarily have to be that, but where you can actually see parallel worlds or parallel universes operating. And it actually teaches a process where you can go through, where you can see if the person is really having problems or they're just opening up their consciousness. And this is very definitely a Gemini issue. And in fact, going back to the story that I mentioned a little earlier, if you look at Hermes or Mercury, who was the winged messenger in mythology, he was responsible for bringing the information to the different worlds. And it wasn't just the upper worlds, it was the lower worlds, it was the underworld, it was the world of the dead that nobody went into, because if anybody normally went into the world of the dead, they never usually came out. But there was something about this character who was able to go into that underworld, the world of the dead, and always come out unscathed. In fact, if anybody really wanted to get someplace where they weren't supposed to go, they could connect with him and he could get them in. It's sort of like my friend who is the bouncer at such and such a club, okay? He'll let us in because he knows me. They always know somebody. If you ever want to get a resource or a service, or you want to know somebody who does a service, you always talk to your Gemini friends, because they have an incredible network. I call it the drum network, the drum beat, that knows who to get what from whom, because they're the master traders of the zodiac. And again, this is why you see them in the horse trading business, so to speak. Now, there's an interesting comparison here, because when we talk about Virgo, which is not the sign of Gemini, but when we talk about Virgo, we also talk about Virgo being ruled by the planet Mercury or Hermes. But Virgo is more associated with the god Thoth in mythology, who was the officer of the court and who was the scribe of the sun god Ra, and in many stories he's considered to be the son of the sun god Ra. As, of course, Mercury or Hermes is the son of the sun, Zeus. But the difference between these two characters, the difference between the Gemini, which comes earlier in the zodiac, and Virgo, which comes later in the zodiac, is that the first one, Hermes or Mercury, is less responsible and less developed in many ways. In other words, less developed on the emotional level. And this is one of the challenges in a Gemini's life, is, again, trying to bring that emotional stuff in. It's really hard for them, because their whole purpose is just simply to carry information and help act as magical catalysts for people's lives. If we look at the Virgo version, Thoth, the son of the sun god Ra, he's a little bit more detailed, because his whole job is to sort of stay in one place, bring people into the underworld, weigh their heart. If they're not ready to enter the underworld, he has to stay there again and slowly but surely heal them and prepare them to slowly move into the underworld. So he has more of a responsibility here, and more of a much more deep responsibility, and deeping not only with feelings and emotions, but the processes and growths of life.
Hello, this is Georgia Stathis. You've been listening to our Archetypes series, Myths and Signs of the Zodiac, and we thank you. If you liked what you heard and you'd like to know more and hear more, please go to our website at starcycles.com, where you can find an assortment of available tools, pieces of information, and things that you can use in your own practice or in your own study of astrology. Again, thank you so much. and we hope to see you soon.